I don't want you to get the idea to imagine that I expect to reciprocate or in any way feel I'm due overindulgence by my peer pedestrians on the sidewalks. But I had the experience today of being pointedly misconstrued with a snap judgment by someone who heard something I said and proceeded to leap on me with the full truth and nothing but the truth, so help them God. Now, when you have a complex situation, there's a good deal of study to understand, to come to grips with even the first points of departure. If you're an honest human being, you realize that even other people who've done the work have to be given some lassitude to make their point of view understandable before you can just snap and I know what they're talking about to denounce if you're on the gravy train of the denouncers who leap to the forefront with torch in hand to denounce what they are sure is wrongheaded the minute they hear a single peep out of someone else. But all the same, I thought that I would make this tape so that I could say, if you really want to know what I think, may I suggest you watch my tape? And they can say no. And I will say, then you don't know what I think. So stop pretending. The first thing I will say is, I don't know all the answers. If somebody wants attention in this world right now, it's that Boris Putin dude, whatever his name is, Vladimir Putin. He wants all kind of attention. So, and a lot of people want to put on the boxer's nose mask and say, put him up, you know, and it's gotten pretty ugly in the Ukraine. So, what I thought I'd talk about is my opinion about the Ukraine, this being May 13th, 2022, which is, I believe, Friday of this world, is it? So, I have a lot of other things I'd like to be doing, but to identify me and what I think is happening, you have to be able to understand the predicament and the swath of issues that are going on that find people picking and choosing where they stand in a subject that requires a good deal of study. It's not really self evident what's going on. Now, this will be refuted. Someone will say, Menace is clear because there was an invasion. Russia invaded, and that's simply how it works. To a greater or lesser degree, that is quite true. So we'll start from the point of view that the invasion was wrong. Do we understand what the invasion is about? Do we understand what caused it? Do we understand why some people want to stand off aloof? Do we understand why some people may support it? Do we understand the role that at the very minimum Russia claims we played in provoking it? Do we understand the consequences and costs of pursuing a refusal to negotiate to Ukrainian civilians that could possibly be ameliorated by negotiations? Let's assume we do understand all those issues, just as a point of argument for the moment. Let's suppose all those pictures have been weighed, thought carefully about, and arrived at. Do you still, at this point, know where I stand when I say the Ukraine invasion was wrong? You don't know anything about it. I could be saying that I think we should surrender. but it was wrong. You don't know that I would think that. I certainly don't think that. But who gives me the right to say we? We're talking about Ukraine, not NATO. So we means what if it includes me? In discourse? See, one of the problems with people who make snap judgments is that they don't, even if they've considered a lot of things, know the point of view of the person they're making a snap judgment about. Let me make it possible for you to gain some true insight into where I'm coming from, which I hope to explain further as I make this case and go on with this tape. My question, which I see as paramount, isn't what caused the invasion, isn't what Putin hopes to gain from the invasion. Both of those questions loom very large. They're the central questions in the newspaper. What caused it? What does he want? Will he stop? Who is he menacing? What's next? You see that all the time in all of the newspapers and magazines and Twitter. But my question is, why would all of these powerful men, many of whom are loyal to Trump or were loyal to Trump at one time, be creating and want a seemingly intractable situation like this deranged war at this time? Now, what does that say about me? What that says about me is I believe something is going on under the hood. And let me tell you a little bit about the sources I've come to attempt to study as closely as I possibly can. Some of these sources I have handy right here. They include books about structuring post-communist Russia from the period around 2004, where things first started to go awry from Glasnost. I have books about the political and literary scene in post-Soviet Ukraine. I have books about destroying Yemen, which is a statement about what NATO is capable of. And I have books of just simple scholarship from Russian scholars to show my appreciation for them and some of the things that they're capable of that are masked and not necessarily entered into the record because of what Putin says is an attempt by the West to cancel the culture of Russia. I certainly don't want to be seen in any way as canceling the culture of Russia. I think that America has a long way to go before we can brag and preach. But at the same time, I think that America had an active role behind the scenes in setting this situation up. Why, for example, did the Veterans Administration in the state of Washington prepare me with left wing American communist documents about Donbass before the situation got underway? Clearly, it was an advisory approach to what they evidently knew was coming, that it wasn't a big surprise. This was before the forces began to uh, be amassed at the border. So if you check my Google email as a spy, you'll see that's true. I'm not inviting you to, but when these things come up, they pertain to my historic research in obscure intellectual circles who advise Hollywood, and with it, the strange form of entertainment media that the climate change crowd is up against called news. Now, to understand the traditional approach to the problems that are going on between Russia and Ukraine and Russia and NATO, takes a good deal of work and fathom. Some things most people can recall. Maybe they garble it a little when they speak of it. Many people know that in 1989 the Berlin Wall was taken down and Mikhail Gorbachev introduced a form of politic known as glasnost, which meant to be open, transparency, we call it in the West. And this was met with mixed signals from the conservatives in the Bush administration, who were held over from the Reagan administration, who had met with Gorbachev. Um, Now, when you look at me, I'm someone who has done my homework about the fascism in the right wing of the United States. I certainly did not like Reagan. And the more I investigated, the more I saw conspicuous signs that Holy War was behind AIDS and that it was an attack. And I see the same gyration in the way that Roe versus Wade is being um, overthrown on the heels of the COVID 19 follow up attack. So, what you're hearing is somebody who believes something has gone on beneath the surface in the holy war scene from the Royal Orthodox Church and Trumpy tune on high, and some members of the Supreme Court like Clarence Thomas, who want us to reform our immoral ways. Now, as peculiar as that may sound, when you look at the simplicity of it, it actually tends to hark to the oversimplifications that people are capable of. And it replaces analysis instead of having complex ideas that are carefully considered scholastically. You get a form of bypass that helps you avoid garble. Now, most people will say this is a paranoid delusion. None of this is true. Well, that's okay. That's another shortcut. But there's a shortcut to saying that immoral people should be shut down. And one of the things I learned about this crowd was investigating them through the British intelligence services. They had a lot of influence over um, British rock and roll music and media. The Beatles, for example, who used to trot off with the Maharishi, found their way into Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. P.D. Ouspensky was born in Moscow. He did a lot of work in Kharkiv, Ukraine. And he was well received by the librarian at UW, who helped me find a remarkable book about modern art in Russia, which placed him with Prokofiev and Picasso back in the 20s. So he's a highly influential person. And if you know anything about my research about racism in Hollywood, beginning with D.W. Griffith, demonstrated that they were also pro Nazi forces making Reagan's films. The man who used the Burning Cross for the KKK in a first use of the Burning Cross for the KKK in the film Birth of a Nation, from which it was adopted by the Klan proper, made Reagan's wartime films with Errol Flynn, which are full of pro Nazi symbolism, a lot of it. And I call it semiotic research. Well, so get back to my question. Why are these powerful men who were friends at one point with Donald Trump so interested in an intractable situation in the Ukraine at this point in time? Why, for example, would this Boris or Vladimir Putin, who wants so much attention, I mean, he's come out, he's like Carole King's first song on her best album, Tapestry. It's called Smackwater Jack. He bought a shotgun because he was in the mood for a little confrontation. You just let it all hang loose. He didn't think about the noose. He couldn't take no more abuse, so he shot down the congregation. Can't talk to a man when he don't want to understand. If Boris Putin isn't Smackwater Jack, I don't know who is. But if you look at the question through the lens of the Ouspensky circle, you find that people are behind the scenes. Valieva, Camila Valieva, the fantastic figure skater, accepted fourth place after a very suspicious incident, all pregnant with procedural wrongs, where she supposedly tested for a questionable controlled substance. And she took herself down to the fourth place so that it would be smoothed over and caused a lot of tears, not least among me. But there was some reason. I suspected there was a reference to the fourth way of Ouspensky, and so I've been doing some research on the fourth way. Back when he was hanging out with Prokofiev and Bukowski and influencing those guys anyway, he introduced the idea of the fourth dimension, that we're three-dimensional people, but our being whole hooks from the fourth dimension. And what these moneybag mystics and the oligarchy are pulling behind the scenes is a game of leapfrog across national lines. But the tie that binds them is the idea that there's a fourth dimension at work. So these kinds of arguments for the iconography of the tradition of eternity allow Boris Putin to send the youth of Russia, with whom he should be more concerned, out as knights of resignation into the fields of battle in a controlled parameter that forces people to choose sides. You see Trumpetonians and Reaganites swooping down, saying, choose my side. This is the battle of the immortals. You know, we may all go up in flames over these high principles, and they're acting with snap judgments over something they don't understand. Look, for example, at North Korea. North Korea actually has things in common with the Ukraine. Russia, back in days of Peter the Great and Tsar Nicholas, said that they could not use their language in government or schools. Well, that's what the Japanese did to North Korea. Have some sense towards Asia. Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted the Vichy French out of Vietnam because the Vichy French were allies of the Japanese, and Truman reversed them. I have no idea why, but the weirdest movie I've ever seen is The Green Berets with John Wayne, which opens with the Marines singing in German. That's who the French in Vietnam were allied to, the Germans, the Vichy French, and the Japanese. You can't make a snap judgment about that. These were the Axis figures. Now, if you look carefully at the situation, you would think, well, are you saying that NATO is Nazi and that it's true what Vladimir Putin is saying? To a very threadbare degree, there's truth in what he's saying. But you have to be very careful because that's the trigger that they want. They don't want an exploration of the Ouspensky circle and the leapfrog of oligarch intelligence. They've created a parameter that simplifies it so that if you question NATO's Axis sympathies, you must be advocating for Russia, who committed an unconscionable invasion. So it's more complicated than that. Kirill, the Russian Orthodox Church leader, has been criticized by the leader I favor, which is Pope Francis, for sanctifying this situation as holy war. I believe that there's some truth to that, that they see it as coming from the fourth dimension, that Trump too sees it as holy war, that it was clocked, that it's no accident that the Republicans are overthrowing Roe versus Wade, that Clarence Thomas is every bit as much to blame for the situation as Boris Putin is. Now, if you look at the iconography of Soviet sensibilities, you see those old images of the hammer and the spike engraving things in stone. If it's not engraved in stone, it's not traditional, it's not eternal Russian culture. Well, the situation that they have, their predicament, is that the Russian Federation consists of former Soviet satellites that have never, some of them never had a government of their own. And there's a lot of ebb and flow, and protests are a new thing. The success of protests displaced some Russian Federate sympathizers in power who had been elected in the Ukraine. And of course, there's a near majority of Russian sympathizers, Russian speaking sympathizers in the Donbass. The basis of the idea, which is hated by the people who want spoils war, go out with your hand grenades. So here's our big opportunity to fight Russia on somebody else's backyard. Wipe out the Ukrainians if you have to, but send them a message. You know the type. They've been around for a long time. This situation for them in the Ukrainian um, turf is one of we're supposed to be uncompromising, and they don't want to hear the idea. Let the baby have his bottle. Let Putin have Donbass, and then get back to the hard work of understanding these complex communities that have never had government before and are trying to adjust to the modern world. Well, one of the ways they keep the peace among themselves, about the Chechnya War, is that Muslims and Russians both have a deep and abiding suspicion of modernism. I mean, I'm not their guy. They're certainly not my lawyer. You know, even though I largely favor at least discussing letting the baby have its bottle, give him Donbass, because maybe that'll create something that's simple enough to understand that American scholars will stop um, soiling their own beds in fear of engaging a complex predicament that asks for understanding. But the Muslims are sympathetic to the traditionalists in some degree because they also are borderline authoritarians. I mean, they believe in democracy, they're a bulwark of democracy in former Soviet areas, many of them institutionally favored democracy. But even in the Ukraine, you're dealing with Orthodox people, fundamentalist people who are suspicious of modernism. The argument for modernism is that modernism can be sufficiently flexible to engage the realities of complex situations when courageous enough to do the study. I mean, these people who are jumping up and down, send them hand grenades and stuff, see it as a shortcut and a bypass to anybody doing their homework. They're suspicious of intellectuals. They've been backstabbing the liberal intelligentsia since the days they shot Kennedy. So you're dealing with a framework where there's hidden sympathies across the doctrinary lines, where war serves to void attempts to reform things and change them for the better, where people understand each other. And preservation, they say, is their cause. Preservation of Russian culture. Russian culture isn't going to be preserved, Boris, by destroying the climate, by starving people to death. It's not going to happen. You need to have a situation where people are more protein. They're capable of flexibility. They're capable of being engaging. That's what would make Russian intelligence admirable, exciting. People who have watched you, Mr. Putin, have at times admired your modernism, your grasp of things that are happening now. I don't think that it's necessary for the logic of my investigations to obstruct negotiation over a ceasefire. The logic of my negotiations is that this has been manipulated by people who very predictably saw that they can engineer a backlash against libertinism, modernism, constructive engagement of the academics, liberal inquiry, the great hope for insight and knowledge about one another, diplomacy. They hope they can undermine that with the simple use of the molecule they call COVID 19, terrorize people into shells, cut down on population, and start up a nasty little battle royal to focus people on the fact that they're incompetent and that they have to choose sides, and that there's going to be a big erasure of inquiry into things like Donald Trump's hidden hand puppet show and the oligarch leapfrog situation that put this all together, called the Ouspensky Circle, which I know something about because I've habituated with some of the Trumpetunians in the British rock scene, about which I've talked in my other lectures. So you can roll out my views about that and still see why there should be negotiations, why we should seriously consider just letting the baby have his bottle. Let me explain what the benefits of doing that would be. If we allowed the Russian people to say they were protecting Donbass, we don't know that they weren't. It's a key point. 15,000 people were killed in Donbass, and nobody knows by who or why or how, but it's strongly suspected it was Ukrainian, Western Ukrainian oppression of the separatist Russians. I don't know that. Don't quote me as saying I believe that. I said it looks likely that that's the case. So the Russians, although they've committed heinous acts, and I'm not apologizing for them, they should stop with their argument that they're protecting the people of the Donbass. And that would be a basis of a ceasefire and of rebuilding, God help us, because if we're going to address the climate crisis, we must stop this and we must rebuild. And the best way to rebuild is on appreciating and understanding what the situation is that causes Russia to feel encircled, excluded, and undermined by our scholars, by our politics, and threatened by our military. I believe that most of the mature people in the Pentagon do not want to see this happen, just as they did not want to see the January 6th insurrection happen. So some things have been unleashed in tandem. Some cartoonists like Wags have said that January 6th was Putin at work. Well, the malice in such an idea is clear in the mind of Donald Trump. It's quite possible that these oligarchs are up to something, to put it that way. Now, what I think they're up to is this Ouspensky Circle stuff. The fourth way stands for fourth dimensional politics. So this is why you get into issues of eugenics, for example, as an alternative to fair play towards the masses. What you say is you pick and choose the ARC representatives and put together a rainbow structure. And the Knights of Resignation march to the sacrifice of the great eternal icons. You see what I'm saying? This is the sort of things that has played me, for example, for a fool and sucker, was to make it out that I was misled to believe that freedom included investigating the chain of attack prostitutes that came out of the AIDS combine, successive degradations of the X motive, they put it, to make me subject to a warrant on extermination, which is true. I mean, this is classic war crime, the type of Nazi Germany, but it also comes with a herald from the Trumpetunians in the Ouspensky Circle, who have Kirill and Boris Putin as altar boys. So the classic war crimes investigation that would place a conspiracy behind the scenes playing leapfrog across the nation states with allies in the Supreme Court pulling this nightmare isn't a necessary factor in making an argument for a ceasefire and letting the baby have its pop. And it's not surrendering our historic legacy and the right to inquire about these issues. We still have objective journalism. We still have this tape to work from. We still have these books to question from. But what it's saying is that the principles of the Library Association are the real fourth dimension. The fourth dimension isn't the Knights of Resignation walking to their death to advance the arc of rainbow of Mick Jagger and his media puppet show for Donald Trump, who will make peace by blazing a trail with symbols of dictatorship and authoritarianism from all over the world, for pity's sake. It's a fourth dimension of preserved knowledge and research in classical literature. And believe me, we would be in a much better situation if we had embraced Russian culture and accepted Russian differences and tried to come to grips with the problems and struggles of their predicament intellectually and intelligently. I've read Navalny, seeing that we're dealing with such hardened error that they would lock someone like him up, which is ridiculous. It's silly. He's a wonderful human being. You know, at one point I was thinking of trying to smooth things over somehow with a letter to Duma or something, to try to raise questions. We mean well. I believe that the Pentagon means well when it comes to Russia. I don't believe that the Pentagon per se means to antagonize Russia or unleash Nazism against them. I just wish the people in NATO would be more realistic about what the right wing is capable of and stop making these foolish compromises with them that give the tall tale to a situation like that Putin has created. Because one of the most difficult questions about the whole affair for me comes down to the question of why there's such a persuasive case to be made by Lavrov and Putin that NATO broke its word to them and precipitated this situation. Why there's such a persuasive case that something untoward was done to the Russian sympathizing people, Russian speaking near majority in Donbass. Why is there such a lack of information about what happened to those 15,000 people? Why did American intellectual um, uh, scholarship not try to fathom the former sphere of influence of Soviet Union other than vying for hegemony and sympathy from them? Why aren't we looking realistically at the survival of the culture in those areas? And if there's anything meaningful we can do to enlist them in open trade and addressing the climate crisis together. I think that one of the things that made Mikhail Gorbachev such a sympathetic person to history was that he understood the idea of working together with the United States and wanted America to come over and say, we understand the idea of working together with Russia. But John Tower I saw him on Montana when the Berlin Wall came down, and he was croaking something about the ever more menacing Soviet Union when didn't even exist anymore. Like this other Berlin Wall was needed by the right wing for containment rather than something that Reagan wanted torn down. And so there's a blitzkrieg of opportunism in standing tall and defending the Ukraine. I mean, the Ukrainians are going to do what they want to do. And Biden sure is offering them the material to try to defend themselves. And I think Putin should stop it. But I think there's something to be said for cutting our losses if we can gain a foothold over peace in the future. What happened in World War One? There was peace without victory, it was called. We should look at the possibility of peace without victory. The best victory that my views have is just their survival. But you have a situation where the predicament that Russia is in and the regions around the former Soviet sphere of influence is that um, their cultural legacy is in flux. They need understanding and they need an environment where people encourage them to keep at it. And the hatred for each other just has to go. We've been grinding and thriving and fighting in the name of hatred for one another for so long that we can't recognize the existential threat posed by the near extinction of the bees. Do you understand what's going to happen if we let that happen? So, what in the world, getting back to my question, are these powerful men who were loyal to Trump at one point doing in creating an intractable situation when the spirit of our children, the future of our children is at work? Surely the fourth dimension doesn't excuse that. I mean, we have to look at the world as a place where sanity is called for. And I don't think that I'm in a position to say anybody is more or less insane than the people who thought that invading Congress would save the country. Those people who are capable of doing something like that give legitimacy to the Putin's profession of concern about uh, the Ukraine being used as a launching board against Russia. Now, in closing, I want to say what I felt before the invasion, which was that these concerns should be heard because the Ukraine was I used to have Ukrainian overstamp Nazi stamps with the effigy of Hitler on them. I hated them so much. They were given to me, and they were an historic lesson. So I held on to them for a long time. They got swiped, but it's painful for me to remember what the burglar gurgled at me about them. But I just miss them. Things like that are just a copy from reality. What it said to me was that America is a beautiful place because at one point before the age of Bill Gates and Trump and John Lennon, we had a law. It was my favorite law. I used to talk about it. It was from the postal authorities. Post offices can be very interesting. I love to look at stamps. And it was a law that somehow has been wrecked. It was the law that made me probably my most famous correspondent with Melissa Gellhorn. She appeared on a postage stamp post mortem. It was a law that a living effigy could not appear on a postage stamp. And what informed that law were these horrible misuses of political personas like the Adolf Hitler stamps when he was allowed to make personality cults of what should be an objective legal system with the Ukrainian overstamps. How can someone who collected those stamps with a father who wouldn't set foot even in German airspace? He was so indignant about what had taken place to the Jews. Somebody who collected stamps with his father and saw that what possible impression could be left on a child's mind, but for heaven's sakes, the Ukraine was the corridor through which Adolf Hitler devastated Russia. The Russians fought with the great valor of the Ukrainians. Putin's mother was nearly killed. Thank God she lived. You have to be so overjoyed that they succeeded in putting a stop to the Wehrmacht. It's senseless to cheer the tears of the Knights of Resignation. They shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be doing what they're doing. They need to back off. They need to ceasefire. But I don't think there's any reason why we can't acknowledge our role in misunderstanding the situation so badly that it came to this. I'm sorry for anybody who disagrees, because my goal in having an opinion like that is to rescue the children of the Ukraine from further terror and death, because there's nothing more terrible than a child in fear. It's terrible what has happened. And we need to come together in some sort of agreement that the best thing we can do is to find a way to bring about a ceasefire and stabilization of the situation so that we can address a much greater good, which is to rescue the planet Earth that we all inhabit, which includes rescuing them from this strange mystical circle driving these oligarchs, who I was on to long before this happened.